Grandpa was a cold, distant, hurtful person. He didn't express any great love for his family. Even if Ryan's father was right and there was more to Grandpa's behavior, would it change anything? The person that Grandpa had been was now set in stone. He was dead, and what he left behind was a giant tangled mess of a life. His last great act was to bring Ryan into that mess, because Grandpa just wanted someone to know. The card that came in the box should have just said, "Happy birthday, kid. Good luck having the universe collapse around you." In that moment, Ryan was inclined to agree with his mother about the type of man that Grandpa was, selfish and bitter. But was he always like that? Was that everything that this man had to offer the world? How often is someone so clearly just bad? Ryan walked into the living room where Grandma was sitting by herself watching a show that nobody else wanted to see. He felt as if he'd been ignoring her all night, and he did feel bad about that, but so much of what he was going through was directly tied to the man that she had been married to. More than that, Grandma had never even spoken an unkind word to Ryan about her husband. At least, not that he could remember. Grandma was a warm, kind, loving person. So for Ryan, the question became how she could have married the man that had been described in no kind words by any member of his family. What had she seen in Grandpa that nobody else had? How could she have lived with a man who had caused so much damage? And how much pain could have been spared if the woman had just taken her children and left? Ryan sat down next to Grandma, and she looked over at him with a warm smile. She wished him a happy birthday once again, before turning her attention back to the TV. As she watched the show, she told Ryan that she'd seen that episode before countless times. She didn't need to know who done it anymore. She just watched the show because it reminded her of a different time. Ryan looked up at the screen and watched the show for a few moments. He didn't watch the story playing out. He watched the people on the screen and the items in the background. The almond-colored coffee maker that was hanging from the bottom of a cabinet in the kitchen. The pink jumpsuit that one of the women was wearing, with a blue belt that had a huge gold buckle on it. Grandma told Ryan that if he were to watch enough shows from that era, he would probably see that same actress guest starring on all of them. She was everywhere, until one day, she just wasn't anymore. Ryan looked at the woman on screen once again. She was so young and beautiful, with her whole life ahead of her. Yet he knew that if he chose to, he could pull out his phone and see that life summed up in a few sentences. Now she was old. She might even be dead. A commercial came on, and Grandma still looked at the screen as though she were watching it, but he doubted that she was captivated by a commercial for reverse mortgages. Her mind was elsewhere. He took the opportunity to ask her if she had watched the show when it was first on TV with Grandpa. At this, Grandma brightened up a little bit and said that they used to try to beat each other at solving the mystery. Grandpa usually won, she said. He was always good at figuring out where stories were going. She always told him that he had the mind of a writer, so he should write a book. He never did, though. Ryan enjoyed hearing something about Grandpa that wasn't horrible. He pushed on, asking Grandma what kind of man he was. He told her that he'd heard stories from other people, but he never took the time to discuss Grandpa with her. He was trying to ease her into this conversation as gently as possible. He didn't want to reopen old wounds if her memories were as bad as everyone else's. Even if her memories weren't bad, she might not want to discuss the husband who had died. Grandma looked off to the side for a moment, as if trying to pick something to share with Ryan. He could see her biting the inside of her lip as she thought of all those years that they'd spent together, and as she attempted to sum up those years as quickly as possible. Then she told Ryan that people didn't usually want to talk to her about Grandpa. Some people didn't want to bring up a touchy subject for an old widow, and some people didn't want to discuss the man who had been seen so differently in the eyes of different people. The thing was, Grandma didn't mind the subject. She wanted to talk about Grandpa, because in so many ways he was still alive inside of her. She could stub her toe in the middle of the night and still hear his voice telling her that she should have turned on the light. Sometimes a sarcastic comment would pop into her head, and she would swear that she'd heard it in his voice. Ryan smiled at that. He told her that he'd never heard people talk about Grandpa as having a sense of humor. Grandma nodded at that. She told Ryan that her husband was a very complicated man. He did things that she couldn't understand, and even he hated himself for doing them most of the time. He was just so caught up in his own mind that he sometimes didn't see the people who were standing right in front of him. Countering this, Ryan said that his mother didn't seem to think that Grandpa cared about his family at all, But Grandma was quick to jump in here and tell Ryan that he loved his family very much. She told Ryan that Grandpa wasn't trying to be hurtful. He was scared. He was always so scared. Not just of the wars going on, or the nukes, or the social issues. Everyone was caught up in those things. But Grandpa was taking them all in at once. And to her it seemed as if he were one of those men spinning plates on the end of poles, constantly trying to keep them spinning, constantly trying to avoid breaking them, as if the fate of the world were on his shoulders alone. She told Ryan that Grandpa was afraid of every conversation that he had with someone outside of their house. He ran through every interaction in his head over and over, looking for a stupid mistake that he'd made. He was afraid of every decision because he was scared of choosing the wrong thing, driving down the wrong road, eating at the wrong restaurant. Grandpa was always thinking 10 steps or 100 steps ahead of everyone else, and he couldn't turn that part of himself off. He couldn't just be in the moment. At least, not normally. She understood how different people would see him as cruel or uncaring, but he wasn't like that with her, not when they were alone. Grandma told Ryan that sometimes, late at night, when it was dark and she was just drifting off to sleep, Grandpa would hold her close, as if he were afraid that she might vanish into thin air. When her ear was close to his lips, he would talk to her in a way that he never spoke to other people. He would tell her that he loved her. He would talk to her about the children and how they could rule the world if they chose to. He would tell her stories about his childhood and his family. He told her that he had lost his family not long before they'd met, and there was a part of him that wanted nothing more than to close his eyes and wake up with them. He would tell her that he should have been with them, yet, at the same time, he couldn't stand the thought of leaving the place he was in now, even though he never felt as if he should have been there, and he never felt as though he deserved that life. Even if it means the end of the world, he would tell her, and then he would hate himself for saying it. He always hated himself. At least, that was how it seemed to her. There were good times, Grandma told Ryan. She said that people remember the big moments the most and the worst moments the most. But there were so many small, quiet moments when their family was together, and just the look in his eye would tell her how much he truly loved his family. If there was one thing that Grandma wanted Ryan to know, it was that. He may not have expressed himself well, but he felt more than anyone she had ever known. Ryan allowed his grandmother's words to work their way through his mind, adding to the image that he had been forming of his grandpa. Then he paused and went back to one of her comments about him. Grandma had said that Grandpa didn't feel as if he deserved his life, that he didn't deserve to be there, that he wanted to be with the family that he'd lost. He asked her if that meant that Grandpa was suicidal. Had he ever tried to end his life? Because knowing what Ryan knew now and having seen what was in the box that his grandpa had sent him, he couldn't say that he'd be surprised by the news if Grandpa had tried to do that. At first, it seemed as if Grandma wanted to brush off the idea and discuss it no further. However, a few moments passed, and her expression changed a bit. She looked away from Ryan, pulling deeper into her own mind and her own memories. Then she told him the story of how his grandparents had met. Their story began in 1961. At the time, Grandma was 18 years old, just out of high school, and was watching everyone she knew scatter in the wind. They all had big plans for the future. Some were going to college, some were getting married. Grandma didn't know what she was doing. Half the time she would wander around her small town trying to figure out what the purpose of it all was. At 18, she fancied herself quite the philosophical mind, so she rebelled against everything that her parents had taught her to value. She viewed society as something that people invented just to pass the time and to make themselves feel important to the world. Looking back at herself all those many years later, Grandma was pretty sure that she was just lazy back then. She admitted this with a smile. She worked as a waitress in the only diner that existed in her town. No McDonald's, no Taco Bell. Back then, this was the one place that people could go if they didn't feel like cooking for themselves, so the place was always crowded, and the work was hard. When the diner closed at night, she would walk home in the dark. It didn't seem like such a big deal back then. She never worried about serial killers or anything like that. She barely had to worry about cars on the road after the sun went down. Grandma enjoyed the walk. She allowed her mind to wander as she looked up at the stars and the wind washed away some of the smells from the diner. It was quiet out there, and she loved being truly alone, even if it was only for a little while each night. Except one night, she wasn't alone anymore. She chuckled as she spoke those last words to Ryan, as if there were some joke that he wasn't in on. Grandma went on, telling Ryan that it was the middle of summer and the air was thick. She was approaching the bridge that led over a river, not far from her house. The sound of the water made her want to stop for a swim, but she never did that. She wasn't as impulsive as all that. As she approached the bridge and looked across it, she spotted a man standing right in the middle of it, pacing back and forth. He looked as though he were caught up in an argument with himself, rubbing his temples and smacking himself on the side of the head. He wiped away tears and nodded, finally appearing to come to an agreement with himself. Grandma watched all of this play out from a distance. She hid herself just off to the side of the bridge, wondering what this strange man was going to do. Working in the diner, she had seen just about every face that passed through their small town. This man wasn't familiar to her, though. She'd never seen him before in her life. He was young, not much older than she was. His pants didn't look like they were the right size. His hair was a mess. She was fascinated by the mystery of this man. As she stood there, she saw him take off his watch and throw it into the water. He did the same thing with items from his pockets, as if he were throwing away every trace of himself. Then he climbed onto the railing and looked down at the river below. It was at this point that Grandma left her hiding spot and casually walked onto the bridge, approaching the man as if she hadn't a care in the world. "Gosh, mister, you aren't planning to kill yourself, are you?" she said to him. As she told Ryan this part of the story, she appeared amused with herself. The joke, as she explained it to Ryan, was that the man had chosen the wrong bridge to jump off of if he wanted to kill himself. Kids had probably been jumping off of that bridge all day, and hardly anyone ever died there, so Grandma wasn't exactly worried that the man was going to die that night. What she was worried about was the fact that he wanted to. As interesting as the show was to watch from afar, she didn't want to see someone die and not even try to stop it from happening. Plus, she added, as she approached the man, she realized that he sure was cute. This time, Ryan smiled at her joke. He shook his head, unsure of how much of this story he wanted to hear. Grandma went on. She told Ryan that the man was so upset and alone because he'd just lost his family. He'd lost everything, and he kept telling her that he didn't belong there, he didn't belong anywhere, he shouldn't even be speaking with her. Grandma hopped up onto the railing beside him and looked down at the water. She told him that she knew the feeling, and that was how their first conversation started. They talked up there on the railing for a while, before eventually moving down to the bridge, and then sitting on the grass nearby. They talked for hours, and boy, was her father not pleased with her when she walked through the front door in the early hours of the morning. To answer Ryan's question, yes, Grandpa did want to end his life at one point. He felt like there was no other choice. But she didn't want that one moment on one night to define Grandpa in the eyes of his family. That was the night her world changed forever. And it was a beautiful night. She went on to tell Ryan that Grandpa always seemed to feel so guilty about pulling her out of the life that she'd been living, but she was glad to be out of it. She wouldn't have had it any other way. They met on the bridge every night for 2 weeks. He never did come into town. He kept a distance, camping in the woods and trying to figure out what to do with himself. She'd bring him food from the diner and some fresh socks, and they talked for hours in the dark of night. It was the only time that he ever seemed comfortable letting go of everything that was going on inside of his head. He never told her how he'd lost his family, and she never asked. Whatever it was, she could see that it had damaged him in ways that she'd only seen in a few people since then, people who had been through something truly horrible. After that 2 weeks, Grandpa was beginning to look a little bit better. He was still always on guard, but he was starting to think about what he was going to do with his life, and that seemed like an awful big step for someone who had been ready to end it not long before. One day, Grandma went to the river to bring her new friend some dinner, but she found his camp empty. He was gone, and all that was left behind was a note which told her that he needed to go home. He needed to try to set things straight. She was a sophisticated girl, and it wasn't as though the two of them were going steady. They were just friends, who spent hours talking to each other in the quiet hours of the night, so she didn't sit there and cry. She tried to go on with her normal life, working at the diner and walking home by herself each night. The strange thing was, while she used to love that walk home by herself, she now felt more alone than she ever had before. There were a lot of people in town that she knew and liked, but she'd lost the one person who she felt she could talk to without putting on some kind of an act. As Grandma told this part of the story, she started to speak a little bit more slowly and deliberately. The slight smile on her lips began to fade. Ryan could see that young girl in his grandma's eyes, missing the man who had spent so many nights whispering to her in the darkness. After taking a moment and swallowing the emotions of that memory, Grandma perked up a little bit and told Ryan that about 2 or 3 weeks had passed and she was walking home from work when she spotted someone on that bridge once again. Even from a distance and with his back turned to her, she knew that it was him. And as he turned to face her, her heart began to pound in her chest, and the world started to spin around her. She thought she was going to faint, and she hated the idea of being one of those girls, the ones who fainted. But she didn't faint. Instead, she ran onto the bridge and threw her arms around him, and he wrapped his arms around her. She was crying out of joy, and he was just crying. She didn't ask why, because she knew that if he was back there with her, it was because he hadn't found whatever it was that he'd gone looking for. Looking back, Grandma thought that maybe she should have felt like the consolation prize for someone who'd lost what he really wanted. But she hadn't thought about that back then. All she could see was what was right in front of her. He was back. Her best friend, whom she had only known for a short while, was standing right there in front of her, and he wasn't going to leave her again. Grandma couldn't remember what the two of them said to each other on the bridge that night, or maybe she just didn't want to share that part of the story with Ryan. However, she did say that once Grandpa had told her that he was back for good and that she was the only person in the whole entire world that he wanted to see, the two of them joined hands and did the thing that they hadn't done the first night they met. Ryan held up his hands as Grandma got to this part of the story, and he quickly told her that he didn't want to hear the next part. Grandma smacked his arm and made a disgusted face. She told him that they climbed onto the bridge railing together and leapt off of it, hand in hand. She had jumped from that bridge 100 times since she was a child. She had experienced the shift in her insides as she dropped, and the twinge of fear as she waited to hit the cool water below. That night she couldn't see where the water was. She didn't know how far she was going to fall, but she knew that he would be there with her when she plunged into the water. Grandpa held her hand tightly as they dropped through the darkness, and as the water enveloped them. When there was nothing but water surrounding them, and she couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet, and she couldn't breathe, and she couldn't see anything but the darkness, he pulled her closer. In that endless void, he kissed her for the first time. In the nothing, she found her home. Looking Ryan in the eyes, she told him that Grandpa was a very complicated man who had experienced some incredibly difficult things. He was lost, and he was hurt. He felt guilty for being alive, he felt guilty for loving her and for bringing children into a world like this, and for so many other things. But she loved him. Without him, she had no life. Without him, nothing that she cared about would have existed at all. Whatever else he may have been to people, it was important to Grandma that Ryan remember this part of him. She wanted someone to know about it when she was gone. When she was done with her story, and after they had sat together for a little while, Ryan thought back on what she had told him, and he wondered if he should tell her the things that she didn't know. Should he tell her what Grandpa had given him and explain what it meant? Should she know why Grandpa was so scared and what he had risked in order to be with her? Did his entire family have a right to know? Did the world have a right to know? It had been less than a day since that package arrived on Ryan's doorstep, and his world had changed forever. It had changed in ways that disturbed him and terrified him, but it also explained so many things that would change his family. He wasn't sure if those changes would be for the better, or if the truth would do as much damage to others as it had done to his grandpa. Whatever else Grandpa was, he was also the first victim of this shift in reality, and it had destroyed him in so many ways. If Ryan were to share the truth with his brother, would it destroy him too? To know that maybe Grandpa was right to believe that he shouldn't be here? Would his father want to know that his entire life had been derailed without his even knowing it? Could his mother think back on that story of what she found in the basement and see it in this new light without it destroying her? Ryan knew what Grandpa felt like on that first night when he met Grandma, when he climbed onto the bridge railing and looked down at the dark water below, wondering if he should jump. Grandpa had sent that package to Ryan, but he wasn't sure that its contents belonged to him alone. He didn't know if he had the right to even make these decisions for other people. Those questions would need to be answered, but there would be time for that. This night wasn't the moment to do it. When he did that to his family, it couldn't be an impulsive decision. He needed to think. He needed space to figure out what it meant and what he should do about it, because he knew that there were consequences to some of those decisions. The wrong move could end it all. At the end of the night, Ryan took his presents and his container of leftover birthday cake, and he gave his mother and grandma kisses on their cheeks as he said goodbye to everyone and walked out into the night. Out there, in the darkness and the quiet, the world as a whole ceased to exist for him. He looked back at his family as they closed the door behind him, and he knew how easily they could be gone forever. Grandpa had experienced that loss. Ryan understood what that meant for the first time in his life, and it scared him. The roads were mostly empty as Ryan drove home in silence. He didn't see other people. He didn't see airplanes flying overhead. All he heard was the sound of his car's engine and his own breathing. He could feel the box that his grandpa had made sitting in the trunk of his car, the power of it, the truth of it. When he got back to his apartment, he brought everything inside and set it all down on his kitchen table. He opened the wooden box and stood back, looking at all of it together, everything that his family had given him for his birthday. A gift card from Grandma, a new phone from the rest of his family, which they'd gotten a good deal on because it was last year's model. And from Grandpa, another phone, which had been found in a box that had been sealed and locked away for at least a decade. A phone with a crack in its screen from having been dropped on the floor by a girl who believed it to be a cigarette case decades earlier. A phone that had a battery too old to hold a charge, and a USB-C port that had been damaged and corroded by age. A phone which was not scheduled to be released for another month.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.